Hello and welcome to Autism Unpacked. I'm your host, Rosie Gilmoss, and we're diving today into a subject that so many families are struggling with, but don't always have the words for. We're talking about emotionally based school avoidance, sometimes known as EBSA. EBSA is often misunderstood as truancy or refusal, but in reality, it's about anxiety or emotional distress that makes school feel completely overwhelming or sometimes even impossible. To help us really unpack this, I'm joined by two incredible guests. First off, I've got Dr. Tina Ray, an educational and child psychologist with over 40 years' experience working with children, families and schools. Tina has written extensively on mental health and well-being, including resources on EBSA, grief and supporting refugee children. She's passionate about creating practical strategies that actually help children and parents in real life. Alongside her, I've got Dr. Leanne Johnson, a consultant clinical psychologist and head of trauma-informed practice. Leanne specialises in helping schools and families understand the emotional needs behind behaviour. She's a real champion of moving beyond labels to look at the whole child. Together, we're going to explore what EBSA is, why it happens, and most importantly, what parents and schools can do to support children through it. Understanding and spotting EBSA. We begin by exploring emotionally based school avoidance, learning how to recognise the signs and reflecting on the importance of using the right language. Welcome, both of you, to the podcast. Thank you ever so much for coming on today. I think it's probably best if we kick off with you, Tina. Would you just give the listeners and me a little bit of an oversight into what emotionally based school avoidance actually is and how it differs from school refusal or truancy or just bad behaviour?
Okay. From my perspective, in a nutshell, I think school avoidance, emotionally based school avoidance, occurs when a child is feeling so anxious that actually prevents them from getting into school. So in essence, it's not a choice. This is something that the child finds so overwhelming that over time they become persistently absent and then totally absent from school. And in terms of thinking about, if a child is just saying, I don't want to go, that is very, very different. This is, I don't want to. This is, I can't manage to get myself into school. I can't cope with this emotionally. And truancy is something totally different. Sometimes it's parentally condoned, sometimes it's not, but this is when a child is making a choice. And I think it's really important when we think about this topic that we do consider our language particularly, because for me, the difference is very clear. If we talk about refusal, which when I began working in this area 40 years ago, that's exactly what we did. It's very pejorative because it suggests that a child is refusing, they're making a choice not to do this, whereas in essence they can't. So that language is really quite dangerous, I think. But sadly, some people still hold on to it in well, thankfully not so many quarters, but they do.
It's really important that we use the correct language around this because it's not that they won't go to school, it's that they can't. So can you think of any sort of really misleading bits of terminology that get thrown around, anything like that?
Yeah, I think as Tina said, 15 years ago, I think when I was on clinical training, the first young person that I worked with, she was school refuser, is what she was, was in the referral notes. So, it's a really pejorative term, isn't it? And we've moved to, we are moving forwards, which is great. So emotion-based school avoidance. And people even talk about actually the word avoidance is really pejorative as well. So for a young person that's really distressed about attending school, actually to be hearing words such as, you're refusing, you're avoiding, when they just absolutely can't is really negative, isn't it? And I just find that children hear these messages, they internalise them as well, and they might
hear a lot more than we know, don't they?
I'm bad, I'm a failure, I can't do it, and it's so damaging to their kind of self-esteem and sense of self-identity as well. So I think there's two reasons around language. There's that one there that the children don't, hear that and start to internalise it. But I think there's also for how we work and understand the children as well. So if I were to say to you, Rosie, tomorrow morning, can you please work with that child who's school refusing? Versus actually, can you work with that child that's, really distressed around attending school? Yeah. I think it just conjures up, two very, very different
It
children,
shifts it totally, doesn't it? The whole dynamic.
Yeah,
it becomes something constructive,
absolutely
more positive that we can do to support someone with anxiety rather than give them that negative pejorative label.
Yeah, and it's not localised in the child then either, is it? I think we need to be thinking, what can we do as a collective to make school a more pleasant place for young people.
I'd say to all staff in any school where they've got children who are persistently absent, what is it? What language are you using? How is your language ensuring that that child feels safe? What are the words that you're using when you engage with that child? Okay, how are you ensuring that they feel safe by what you say to them, by how you approach them? Are you dismissing their concerns? Oh, it'll be okay tomorrow. Or, you don't really need to feel like that because this isn't true. That's not happening. Or are actually using kind of emotion coaching, recognizing it with them, making sure they feel that you're alongside them, saying, yes, I can see you feel anxious, I can see you feel upset. I would feel upset if I was in that situation. Let's think about this together. Let's think about what we can do. What can we do to help you? All of that language that makes you feel safe rather than language that makes you feel labelled, that puts that negative.
It's not about fixing them, is it? It's about supporting them. And I think this idea that they might feel like they're broken and need to be fixed is something that we really have to be careful around.
Yeah. And for me, EBSA is a behaviour, if you like, isn't it? It's the tip of the iceberg, but it's all of what's going on underneath that. If we can understand that and meet those, there's various needs there, aren't there? It's never one thing. But if we can, really make adaptations to support that, that is the thing that's going to help. And it is often about going slower to get there, faster. If we try and do it too quickly, it's just not going to work. It just won't help.
And if that assessment of what's underneath that iceberg thing, I think it's so important because you've got to understand exactly what this means and how that child is experiencing their world from their perspective. And it is so different for different kids. And if you don't do that, then whatever you do in terms of trying to support them is not going to work because you haven't really understood their triggers, their real anxieties, what's happening to them on a daily basis. So I think it's so, so important to do that. So from my perspective, it's not a choice. This is emotionally based. It's something that the child can't manage or cope with effectively. It's not a choice that they're making. They're not refusing. They just can't do it.
What might that look like? What is the difference in how a child, because we've all had our children say, I don't want to go to school, my tummy hurts. How does a parent get to the bottom of whether or not this is EBSA or whether this is the kid trying it on?
I think most parents probably know, actually, to be honest. You know your children so well, and that's almost instinct. But I think when you begin to see your child consistently on a Monday morning, a Sunday evening, becoming anxious, twitching, I don't want to go in tomorrow, and you get those messages, or the first thing they say on Monday morning is, oh, I've got tummy ache, I feel a bit sick, I've got a headache. I think that's the first signal for me. But then when your child also begins to talk negatively about school on a regular basis, and things that they talked about that they usually found enjoyable or pleasurable, they liked about school, suddenly they're not having those conversations with you. They're much more withdrawn. But I think the first instance, it's about how they approach Monday morning and how they approach going to school every morning after that. So I think it's quite evident to lots of parents. They can pick it up quite quickly.
Yeah. And in my house, there's always, if you're not very well, there's no screens. And I find that generally sorts out who's really needing to be off school and who isn't.
Yeah.
I think another thing as well is around the school holidays, isn't it? So I think children are often, parents talk about, they see their child come back at that point, or, they see their spark return again in the school holidays. So I think that's another indicator as well, isn't it? Friday evening, Saturday, generally okay, and then you start again on a Sunday to build up ready for the next week.
Yeah, and that can be, that can come out in meltdowns and what you might perceive as disruptive behaviour. But I guess as a parent, it's learning to identify that your child's behaviours come from a cause rather than just because they're trying to be a bit difficult or they don't quite fancy going into school tomorrow.
First steps for parents. Early intervention and speaking to school is important when it comes to dealing with any anxiety your child may be experiencing. Here's why.
So as a parent, what do you do? Leanne, maybe this is one for you. What do you do if you have a child? In this situation, I'm going to use a primary age child as an example, and they're saying, I'm not happy at school, the school are struggling to meet need, perhaps. What do parents do as their sort of first port of call here?
Yeah, sure. It's really tricky. I think as soon as you can make a move on that, the better. It's better not to leave it, I would say, because problems can become very entrenched, can't they? So I think go into school, speak to school around it and make school know, let them know that your child is really struggling with school. I think if you can ask your child what they're struggling with, how do they describe it? What's their experience like? Are there certain things about school that are really tricky for them? So we know that, first thing in the morning can be tough when they're just expected to come and sit down and do their work. Year one is a big transition point actually for a lot of young people, whereas reception is very much play-based, isn't it? And there's huge expectation then from sort of year one and year two, isn't there? So I think talking to school really, really quickly is very, very helpful. Keep some logs, I think yourself as well. Keep a bit of a journal. Describe, what it's like at home as well, because sometimes your child can look so different between home and school. And I know that we'll probably talk about masking at some point, but I think sometimes schools find it difficult to believe actually how a child is presenting at home. So I think having some logs, some journals that you can talk school through that, as well as I know some families also do take small sort of video snippets, don't they? Just so that schools really understand what is happening at home as well.
And do you find that a lot of schools are still perhaps a little bit behind in understanding of EBSA? Obviously, there's an enormous pressure on schools to meet attendance targets. So that in itself is going to be putting pressure on parents to get their kids to school. And I'm thinking when they're primary school age, you can almost kind of lift them up and take them in. But obviously that then raises concerns about what damage could we unwillingly be doing to a child by forcing them into an environment where they're clearly not happy. So, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly believe that you should never, ever force a child to go into school when they're so emotionally distressed. Years and years ago, and I was managing a behaviour support team, the policy on school refusal, as it was called then, very pejorative, was that we actually get them back in as soon as possible, and parents were encouraged to drag their children in, kicking and screaming, leave them in the front entrance of the school, crying, and the mums and dads and carers were expected to just walk out and leave them. And I found that incredibly cruel, obviously then, and now I would be horrified if I saw that happening in schools. Sadly, in a very small number of schools I've experienced this still, but I just think, no, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. This has got to be much more gradual, and it has to be step by step. So, if you think about how you get children back into school, for example, I always use the analogy of a swimming pool. You would not expect a child to learn to swim just by throwing them in. They drown. You'd get them to put their feet in first and then up to their waist and then their neck, and gradually get to the stage where they could put their head under the water. And I think that's so important, that it is a graduated response, and we don't do this anymore. In essence, I think the damage is huge if you do that, because you're actually punishing a child for experiencing anxiety and trauma. So you're re-traumatizing them. And then, the other advice that I thought was so awful to give to a parent was, well, when they're at home, actually, they're not allowed to do anything that gives them any pleasure or joy. You just have to keep them there so that they realise that they're missing school, they're missing their lessons, they, need to know that they should be there. And I think also that's wrong, because your child's been so anxious, so stressed by being in school. The last thing you want to do is then punish them at home. Home should be their safe base. Yeah. And this really happens, I think, EBSA, when school is not a safe base for a child. If you don't feel safe, then you cannot actually balance your nervous system properly, and you're not going to learn, you're not going to feel okay in school. So from my perspective, at least if they feel safe at home, then what you then do is work out how to make them feel safe in school, what adjustments need to be made in order to be able to get that child back in so that they feel that they can manage and they've got the right support mechanisms. And that's not just about saying we need to change you, the child, you need to be more resilient. It's about saying, what can we do, working together, mum and dad, carer, and the school staff, to create a place for this child where they feel they can cope and they can manage. And I think, this move now towards actually really ensuring that we all work together, we listen to each other's voices, is absolutely essential. I mean, you were saying earlier, Leanne, about, keeping a log of the child's behaviours and how they've responded and what makes them feel anxious. In my view, that is the most crucial part to all of this, getting a child back in, is the actual stuff we're doing to research, to investigate, why is this happening? What's occurring? What's the difference? Because it's all different for every individual child, so that we can actually develop an intervention that's really bespoke to that child. So it's incredibly important to do that, rather than think we can do the same thing, it's going to work for all our children and get them back in, because we're all different. We're all so different.
And I'm guilty of this. When my son was in primary school, I would take him to the school gate, the head teacher, sometimes another member of staff would come out.
Yeah.
They would forcibly remove him from me, take him into school. I would drive home crying.
Yeah.
And knowing what I know now, of course I wish I hadn't done that. But I think you do what you are told and what you believe is the right thing.
Absolutely.
And there is so much pressure on parents to get their children to school.
Pressures on parents and families. The challenges that neurodivergent young people face can have a big impact on families. Let's listen in on what those implications might be.
I currently have a child who is school avoiding, and so we're embarking on homeschool. But for a lot of parents, that isn't an option. So if a child is unable to attend school, the pressure that might put on the family and the parents. What can you tell me anything about that, Leanne?
Yeah, it's absolutely huge, Rosie. And I think I would just say to families that have, you're following professional advice, aren't you? And you want to do the best for your child. And, that's what you do. So please, I would just say, don't feel guilty about that. I think we can't do better until we know better or differently, can we? But I think it puts huge pressure on families, absolutely huge. If you're a working parent, you've got a meeting to be back from the school run at 9 a.m. and, it's just so challenging. I think the mornings are very, very tricky, I think, often for children that really struggle with anxiety.
And then if you can't get them into school and you're trying to earn a living, this is going to have a financial implication on a lot of families.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, having those conversations with work, again, are really important so they know the picture. I think financially, obviously, people end up leaving their work, don't they?
Yeah.
They might get a phone call at, lunchtime to come and pick your child up. And, sometimes you can't just sustain that role, can you? So I think it has huge implications for families, for siblings.
Well, I was thinking siblings, yes, because I've got 2 children in school and 1 at home, and I'm not sure how this is going to go down after a while.
You
I'll
broached
report
it,
back next episode.
Possible causes of EBSA. Next, we explore how moving from primary to secondary school can be an overwhelming experience and how much it helps when children know they have support.
Now, you touched briefly about what could cause EBSA and anxiety, not feeling safe. What are the other things that could cause this? Let's have a look at sort of secondary school transition, because I'm guessing that that's a pretty pinnacle age in terms of school avoidance.
I think that's huge. And that's where I would say the majority of my work has been, in effect. It's always transition, but primary to secondary is enormous. It's enormous for children who aren't neurodivergent. Children who, loads of research to show us this, that transition period, even those children who are academically very able, performing really well, they all take a dip academically. Everyone does, because it's so different. It's huge, loads and loads of different teachers to suddenly cope with, lots of noise, lots of movement, huge playground, big playing fields, etc. And I think for a lot of children, it's totally overwhelming. And there needs to be far more, in my view, kind of alterations made, things done so that for some of our children, when they're going into school, they know reassuringly they've got a lot of support structures there, because it's all very well teaching them how to be resilient. We can do that, and giving them skills of, manage their emotions, calming themselves down, deep breathing, etc. But actually, it's not just, they should not have to be the one responsible for all of that. And I think in many secondary schools now, there's a huge amount that they're doing in terms of making the transfer easier for all of their children. Things like actually getting them in a week before the term starts, giving them that slow move into it. One of the best pieces of best practice I saw, and this is a long time ago, was that all the year 7s who came into this big high school actually operated in one building, and the teachers went to them, so that there wasn't that kind of just that great big change all of a sudden that you've got to deal with 16 different personalities, ways of teaching, stuff like that. So I think that's important. But also, for neurodiverse children, the sensory issues are enormous, and that can be it makes such a difference, I think, for them in terms of their anxiety levels, because all of a sudden it's just so noisy. There are too many distractions. And then the second thing that I think is really, really important is just feeling safe with other people, because they will have been in a small context, had friends around them. They'll suddenly go to high school and find they're not in a form group with anyone that they knew they try to make that happen, but very often it doesn't happen. And what do you think, Leanne?
Yeah,
It's just,
the same. I think, primary school is such a safe cocoon often for children, isn't it? They're in one class with one set of children who actually often are really accommodating for that child that needs some extra support. The teacher knows, can predict perhaps, what I need to do to support this young person. And then they move to secondary school. And like you say, it's just so much transition. I think my middle son has just moved, and just finding his way around the classrooms is absolutely huge, isn't it? From lesson to lesson, it's a transition each hour, which is absolutely huge, isn't it? So that is definitely huge. I think too, just thinking about the statistics around kind of neurodivergence and the correlation between EBSA. So I think we're looking at around at the moment, I think about 82% of children that struggle with school attendance are neurodivergent, as autistic. About 90-something% are neurodivergent, actually, Rosie. I mean, the stats, kind of vary. But actually, I think it really is. It makes it so much more challenging at that point.
And that really highlights that this is a massive problem within the autistic community, that schools really are not meeting needs.
Yeah. And I think it's often at that point as well, when actually you might not have realised that your child's neurodivergent, or because primary school has been such a protective,
especially if they're a girl
element. Absolutely, a girl that masks, for example. Whereas actually, as soon as they go to secondary, things can, people talk about falling off a cliff, or things can change very, very quickly.
Yeah, I can remember it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Feeling safe at school. The risk of bullying is real. Now we can get the expert view on the impact that bullying can have and what can be done about it.
I'm thinking about things like bullying and social and communication issues. And for a lot of neurodivergent young people, they might not fit into these kind of cliques and social groups. Whereas at primary school, perhaps they were able to have good friendship interactions. So is there a greater risk to these children of being bullied?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, in my view, that's where I think the majority of girls that I work with have all been bullied, significantly bullied, all the neurodiverse girls. And it's because all of a sudden it's puberty, everything's going off hormonally for these kids. And I think it becomes more obvious, that kind of ability to kind of model yourself on someone else, you slightly lose it, because all of a sudden your specialness, your uniqueness becomes more apparent to the other kids. And that is the cause of it, because sadly, there's something in human nature which actually makes us kind of frightened of difference. So that bullying tends to occur far more at that stage, in my view. And I think one of the big things that I've worked with schools on is actually saying, at break times, that's a really big problem for many of them, is actually, let's get the nurture group working. Let's get this safe base working so that there is somewhere, say, they can go with a couple of other kids and do stuff that actually is reassuring, is fun, so that they don't experience this tension and stress continually throughout the whole day. And when you've got those kind of danger points, and I'd say they are lunch times, they are break times, we need to give them some respite. And that would be a first way of doing it, not expecting them to suddenly fit in and feel socially okay. When A, it's all new, but B, they are being bullied, they are being targeted.
They're not safe.
They're not safe. And, I think the safety aspect is so important. When we've finished with COVID, which we haven't really, but that's another issue. But during that COVID period, I was working with lots of children online and parents. And what was so significant to me was how a lot of these kids thrived, because they were out of that context. They weren't experiencing the social pressures to be sociable when they didn't want to be. They could learn online at their own pace, and they could indulge in their interests in their own way. So, lots of children, their reading age has developed enormously. There's lots of research to show this. But, parents were saying to me, they're happier.
Yeah.
I really don't want them to go back to school. And this was a tricky thing, because actually it compounded it. Kids that were not attending before COVID, for example, it was, I think now there's still about 50% of them are still not attending well, even though that was so many, it started 5 years ago. And I think that's so important, just to factor into our thinking, what is it in school that's not making them feel safe? And there's a lot we can do to protect them from the bullying. There's a lot we can do to actually give them respite during the school day so that they're not oversensitized, they're not overwhelmed. I mean, you must do lots in your schools where you're actually making sure children feel okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to think about masking a little bit more as well, if, young people really do talk about how come they can do it? How do they find it so easy? And, it just comes so naturally. And I really can't do it. And I think that is really traumatizing for young people as well, isn't it? That kind of, lack of ease of being able to do it. It reminds me of, I was just thinking a little bit about that sort of neuroscience, the teenage brain, a little bit of that, that significant point. But there's two parts of the brain really that are really developing in the teenage years. There's a social reward system. So that's when children really start to sort of be more aware of peers, start to kind of compare themselves to peers as well. And obviously if you're neurodivergent as well, that's a really challenging and confusing time, isn't it? And then there's also this sort of self-management system of the brain as well. So that's where you start to kind of become an adult. So you start to think more about planning, organising. And again, it's another sort of really, really challenging time for teenagers anyway. But if you've also got the added, challenge of being neurodivergent.
I was thinking, she talks about going to all the different classrooms, about the level of responsibility that kicks in, because at primary school, your parents, your carer will make sure your uniform's ready, your lunch is ready. You've talked a little bit about masking here, and we know that masking is particularly prevalent in girls. So are we seeing a representation of that in school avoidance as well? Are we seeing that girls are more likely? How might it look different between girls and boys? I don't know. Want to take that one, Leanne?
Yeah, I think there's an absolute increased risk of both masking and EBSA with young people, with young females. Absolutely. I think we're kind of socially conditioned from quite a young, talking of being a female as well, we're socially conditioned from a very young age, I think, aren't we? To sit nicely and to, be social, be a good girl. So I think girls really do pick up on those messages, even if they're not directly said to them. It's very subliminal, isn't it, around society? And I think that really impacts masking as well. I think the impact of masking for young people who are neurodivergent as well. We know that, stimming, for example, passion, focus, interest, they really help regulate young people, don't they, that are neurodivergent, from an emotional level as well as from that sensory regulation perspective as well. And actually, if they're holding themselves in and holding themselves together for the best part of the day, that's when we get to, I don't know if you always used to use the term, but the 3 o'clock. The 3 o'clockers, the 3 o'clock children, that actually, the teachers just see them completely relaxed throughout the day. As far as they're concerned, they look absolutely fine. But they just fall out when they get home from school. And it's so challenging for families, that is.
And also, I'm guessing that poses a problem for parents or carers, because they will say to the school, my child is coming home and they're very dysregulated, they're having meltdowns. But from the school's perspective, if they're being a good girl in class and they're going to their lessons, they perhaps won't appreciate how damaging this might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think schools often don't quite believe it, do they?
No, they don't. And I think it's not about simply making a video of your child having a meltdown, which I'm kind of, you could do it, but I think it's about school staff understanding what that is, why it happens. And actually having some training, really good training in this area, because I've heard teachers say, well, I don't care, it's not my problem.
Oh, wow.
Okay, literally, it's not actually my problem, because you can deal with that when you take him home or her home, mum. And I find that very difficult to contend with, but you can actually help with that in terms of actually providing those teachers with the information that they need and the understanding that they need, so that they can make those allowances throughout the day. If you are feeling overwhelmed and you want to engage in one of your behaviours that would help you to regulate yourself, then you need to have a timeout card. You need to have somewhere to go. You need to have a safe space, a safe base, a safe person to go and talk to. So all of those kind of alterations in the school context can be made quite easily, but it has to be that people understand that, and that parents feel that they can go in and actually express all their concerns to the staff and will be understood. That is so, so important, rather than being told, well, you've got to deal with it, or actually he's fine or she's fine here. That's not helpful at all, really.
And I think it's helping children feel comfortable with that as well, isn't it? Because often these children really don't want to look different or be different. It's horrifying to them to think that they need to, have a red card that they show to the teacher to, you know, to be able to, leave the classroom.
Yeah.
So I think it's so important to listen to the young people and to ask them about how it's going to feel most comfortable for them. You know, is there a kind of a small signal that you can use, or is it just that, you know, I need to go to the toilet, or, you know, is it sitting closer to the teacher at the front so that actually they can be a bit more kind of eyes on the young person as well. So I think it's always working with
that
the
kind
young
of collaboration
people.
between the three of you.
Really important. Yeah.
And I think being sensitive and compassionate about it is so important, because it, as you said, it doesn't have to be obvious. You don't have to put a child on the spot and make them feel that they are so different. You could do it very, very gently. Absolutely. You know, it's just sometimes it's a wink. You know, this is our agreed form of communication in order for me to be able to move myself from the classroom and get some calm space.
And that gives the child back a bit of autonomy, doesn't it? A bit of a voice in this. Yeah. Because if they are distressed and unhappy and they don't feel anybody's... We've all been there, haven't we? Where people won't listen and you're upset. And so if they feel it's a very small concession, but even just knowing it's there might be enough to keep them in class.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Advocating for your young person. A focus on the positive can be a good way to begin talking to your child's school about their situation, as we find out now.
So if a parent has got a child that really can't go to school, or they're really, really struggling, and they go to speak to the school, they make an appointment with a Senko, they get in, and the Senko is not receptive. They either don't believe it, don't think it's warranted in the situation. How do you advocate as a parent?
I think, as we said before, I think keeping a log of everything, I think, is really important. I think that to advocate for your young person, you can feel very emotional and very passionate and go in and want to kind of listen to me. But actually, for me, I think the effective thing that we can do with EBSA is all around relationships, isn't it? I think, and it's not just with the young people, but also with the staff as well, and with the team. In my experience, schools are always, you know, generally trying to do their best, aren't they? They're so limited in resources, so limited, you know, financially, as well in terms of, you know, budgets. So I think they're always trying to do their best. So I think in terms of how we approach that conversation with, you know, staff with Senko is really important. So perhaps, you know, starting with what's working well, actually, with my child. What are you doing well? What are the positives that we can celebrate? I think that's always a nice place and an effective way to start with schools. And then what is difficult still. And if you can bring the child's voice into that as well, you know, so specific times, so lunch times are really tricky, because actually when they go to the canteen or the cafeteria, the smells are just too much. They're too overwhelming. So if you can be really specific about certain times of the day, that you can bring in some reasonable and very sort of powerful adjustments, and make some specific suggestions for your young person, I think that's really helpful for Senkos as well.
And I think if you feel that as a parent that you are really kind of showing your anxiety and you're worried about that because you don't want to be labelled as the anxious, pushy mother, dare I say it, because that's usually, in my experience, what happens. I take someone in with you, a friend that you've talked to. I have actually done this with parents myself as a friend and gone into the school with them, not as the psychologist telling the school what to do, obviously, but just there as an emotional support, because we've talked about it, we've planned how that conversation might go and the kinds of things that reasonably the parent could expect. And I think it's important that before you go in, you know that they should have a policy on this and that you know what that policy should look like. You know that the Code of Practice demands that they take or ensure that they make these amendments, these adjustments for children with this kind of anxiety disorder. It's a mental health issue, for example, but also that you've got a really concrete plan yourself showing the sorts of things you think they could be doing in school to help your child, because this has worked in other contexts or it works at home. So I'm sharing my kind of solutions to these things with you, but I'm not actually sitting here in judgment of you saying you're not doing this. It's not accusatory. And that is really quite hard, because actually sometimes it really needs to be accusatory in my heart. I want to make that response because it's just so difficult and it's evident that these things are not happening. But if you can come up with 3 or 4 things that you know would make a real difference. So rather than be overwhelmed in the dining hall, let's have a separate little room where some of these kids can go off and eat their lunch. And that's not difficult to do in a big high school. So I think as long as you can present it as these are reasonable, small adjustments you can make that would help. and making sure that it really does come from the child, that your child has told you exactly where it's going wrong, exactly where they're mostly more anxious than ever, and they need to have this happen in order to make sure that they can just stay in that place and feel calm. I think that's really important. So it's kind of being really concrete about it and planning. Because the moment you don't feel in control, it's usually when you haven't got a proper plan. And then your anxiety levels increase. So, and I think it is important. You want to present as someone who's really concerned, but not actually accusatory and putting blame on the school.
That brings us to the end of the first half of our discussion on emotionally based school avoidance. If you found this useful, then don't miss the second part of the conversation, so you can be confident you have the knowledge and the tools to support your child.